So Loma Linda truly is not a blue zone.
It's not.
Oh, really?
Well,
Uh,
blue zone is not a very scientifically definable term anyway.
Mhm.
It's just these
Okay.
places where there are long-lived populations that happen to be studied and identified.
Welcome to Do You AGRAY, a space where we have real conversations. I'm your host, Bassam, and I have with me Kevin, Jermeen, my co hosts, and today we're excited to have Dr. Michael Orlich. He is a physician and epidemiologist at Loma Linda University. He studied medicine at the University of Michigan and completed his PhD in epidemiology at Loma Linda University. He's board certified in family medicine and preventative medicine. He maintains a clinical practice in preventative medicine at the Center of Health Promotion, Loma Linda University, and teaches in the School of Public Health. Um, and for several years, this is why you're here, he has served as an investigator with the Adventist Health Study 2, investigating the relationship of various aspects of diet and major health outcomes. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, so
Good to be with you all.
Have you?
tell us, Doc, give us, before we get into the study, what it's about. We want to learn more about you, who you are, where did you grow up, what got you interested in medicine in general.
Yeah, I grew up in Indiana, Northwest Indiana, around Gary. And my father was a steel worker there. It's a big steel industry sort of area, kind of like Pittsburgh. And when when I was around 13, my dad was about 53. He had a heart attack, and it was a mild heart attack, fortunately, and he had bypass surgery. He had three major arteries that were highly narrowed, like high 90s percentile narrowing.
Wow.
So they did bypass surgery. And after that, that was scary for my dad to be hospitalized and have this big surgery. And he had a complication afterwards where he had a deep venous thrombosis, a blood clot in his leg, and it swelled up. And that
He was young too.
yeah, 50s, early 50s. So that's when you have a heart attack before age 55, that's usually considered an early heart disease history and an extra risk factor. So for me, that's a risk factor for heart disease. And so he radically changed his lifestyle after that. He had always kind of grown up as a meat and potatoes kind of guy, and maybe a quart of Dairy Queen. Kind of grew up in a sort of a rough crowd with 6 Serbian Croatian brothers and a single mother who walked around with a leather belt around her neck. And she was a professional cook. She cooked for restaurants, and so like she would serve the meals when they were teenagers and stuff. All these 6 big boys, with big appetites, hardworking, working on farms and stuff. And she would use those big restaurant warmers and have, one with like sausages and, stuff like that. And so, so he radically changed his diet, kind of followed all the doctor's recommendations, like low sodium, low fat, and started doing aerobic exercise. And so I sort of got into reading about diet and fitness around that time. And then I also grew up with exposure to the Seventh-day Adventist Church through my mother. And so I learned about certain health principles and the concept of vegetarian diets. So that kind of constellation of those two things sort of got me interested in health and nutrition and fitness at a relatively early age. And then when I later in college decided to pursue medicine, I sort of brought that early interest with me. And so in my medical education and training, I've sought out different opportunities to explore what you might call lifestyle medicine
Yeah.
or preventive medicine, or
Mm.
the role of diet and lifestyle in
Mm-hmm.
health improvement and health modification. And
Mm.
so that's some of my background.
I think that's what we're mostly interested in, is the preventative side
Yeah.
and the lifestyle side. And I think for me, for example, I grew up Adventist as well,
Mm,
but we ate meat, and you know, my family had all kind of chronic diseases
mm,
running through, and so looking at that and then learning more, it piqued my interest personally into best diet and things like that. And so, as far as I knew, the better diet was vegetarian, and then 3 months later I went vegan, and and now I'm mostly plant based. I still eat honey. I guess vegan, you don't eat any honey, and you also don't wear leather. So I do eat honey, and to be honest, I cannot say that I noticed a difference. Maybe our diet in general, even though there was meat and fish and chicken and everything like that,
Mm.
it still wasn't too heavy, a lot of oils and too fried. But a lot of people think when you switch immediately, you're going to notice immediate differences. That wasn't necessarily my story. And then now I'm learning that could there be one diet that fit all, and then should I think that my lifestyle is applicable to everybody.
mm,
Um, and so you're involved with the Adventist Health Study, and you were involved as an investigator.
mm.
Can you tell us what is that?
It just means one of the scientists on the study.
Okay.
So my scientific discipline is epidemiology,
Mm-hmm.
and that comes from epidemic,
Yes.
which means upon the people. So epidemiology is the study of patterns of occurrence of diseases in populations.
Mm.
So it might be understanding the statistics about how a disease occurs and tracking it and surveilling it
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And it also involves population-based studies to understand some of the risk factors or causes of different diseases.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my background. So a lot of people now, after the COVID pandemic,
Yeah.
are more familiar with the term epidemiology.
Yeah.
Mm.
And epidemiology did start out with the study of infectious diseases,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not limited to that.
Mm.
Much of epidemiology these days is around chronic diseases. So
Mm-hmm.
you have cancer epidemiologists,
Mm.
or heart disease epidemiologists, or
Mm-hmm.
cardiovascular disease epidemiologists, or obesity epidemiologists.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of my niche is kind of nutritional epidemiology,
Nice.
where we're looking mostly at diet as the potential set of risk factors or
Mm-hmm.
exposures,
Mm.
and how that impacts chronic disease, risk of different chronic diseases, or longevity.
Mm.
So that's your role in the study, but is that the whole role of the study, the Adventist Health Study? Is that what they're after, or there's more to the study?
You could think of the Adventist Health Studies as mostly a nutritional epidemiology, or maybe a little more broadly lifestyle epidemiology study.
Okay.
So there's actually been a series of three Adventist health studies.
Mm.
So there was one that was started way back in the 1950s.
Okay.
We usually refer to that as the Adventist mortality study.
Mm.
And this was in the era when there was a lot of research around tobacco smoke and health. This is before the Surgeon General's warning, and there was still a lot of debate and uncertainty in the
about
scientific community as
Yeah.
to whether smoking really did cause these diseases. And Seventh day Adventists, because of their teachings around health, there are very, very few smokers among Seventh day Adventists. So
Yeah.
it was an opportunity, in conjunction with a broader study by the American Cancer Society at the time, to study a group of non-smokers and see how they compared to other populations in terms of cancer risk and that sort of thing, and start to look at them as group. So that's the first study, the Adventist mortality study, we call it now. And then there was another study in the 1970s was when it was started. And that was called the Adventist Health Study. Now we tend to refer to it as the Adventist Health Study 1. And papers were published from that study. It was started in the 70s, but papers were published all the way through the 2000s.
Wow.
So these are long-term follow-up studies.
On the same people?
The same people.
Okay.
And so the first Adventist mortality study was, I think, about 23,000 people, all in California. The Adventist Health Study 1 from the 70s, that was about 34,000 Seventh-day Adventists across California. And then the current study, what we call the Adventist Health Study 2.
Is that the one you were involved in?
The one that
current
I was mostly involved in. Yeah, the current study. It started around the year 2000, and it recruited about 95,000 Seventh-day Adventists from across North America, or more specifically, the United States and Canada. And so it was about 3 times as large as the previous Adventist Health Study 1. So
Bigger.
with that bigger group, more diverse group, geographically, it was also racially more diverse.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, there was an intent to recruit particularly African Americans as an understudied group. So about 25% of the study was African American. And so much bigger study, more diverse, and there it has in that way more what we call power, statistical power to, because if you're studying, let's say, the risk of colon cancer or something, just to pick an example. Well, the way that you study that risk in a study like this, these are called cohort studies, longitudinal cohort studies. So you recruit this big group, these 96,000 people. You measure a bunch of things in different ways about their lifestyle, their diet, their medical history, that sort of thing. And then you follow them over time, over years. And then, let's say, after 10 or 15 years, you count, well, how many people got colon cancer? And then you can compare, people who smoked or didn't smoke or drank or didn't drink or were overweight or normal weight or vegetarian or non-vegetarian, and see if there are differences in their rate of getting colon cancer. So that's kind of how the studies work. So the bigger the study, the more power you have statistically to be certain about results, that they're not due to chance. So that's what we mean by statistical power, more certainty that results are not due to chance. So that's the nature of the study.
And what was the purpose of Adventist Study 1, and what were some of the key findings?
Adventist Health Study 1 and 2, I think, were both, well, for sure I can say that Adventist Health Study 2 was primarily funded by the National Cancer Institute. I think that was true of Adventist Health Study 1 as well. So, but for Adventist Health Study 2, the primary scientific objectives of the study were to look at various dietary factors and the risk of cancers. But you can also look at other outcomes like heart disease, and you can find out when people die and what they die of. And so when you're doing a long-term study, kind of the ultimate result, that sort of sums up a lot of things is mortality, when people die, what they die from, and that sort of thing. So mortality and longevity is a key thing that's been looked at in these studies. So I think from the Adventist Health Study 1, there were a couple of key things that we could talk more about that that came out of that. One was looking at what factors tended to reduce premature mortality, or another way of saying that is to increase longevity or increase likely
That would be
lifespan.
interesting. Yeah.
So that's kind of one area. And then another sort of more surprise or interesting specific finding that came out of Adventist Health Study 1 was about the health benefits of nuts. So we could talk about both
Awesome.
of those.
Before that, I want to know who picks the people based on what? Is it randomly picked, or from a specific area, or?
Yeah, good question. So these were recruited through the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay.
So for the Adventist Health Study 1, they were recruited by mail. So it was a mailed invitation to all Seventh-day Adventist adults, let's say, within a certain age range in California. And then it's whoever of those decide, agree to participate in the study.
Yeah.
Adventist Health Study 2, there was a recruitment campaign over several years around the country, the United States and Canada, in churches to try to ask people in the pews to sign up and volunteer to be in the study. So the study is a study fundamentally of volunteers that self-select to be in the study.
Okay.
So it's not a random or representative sample of the underlying population of Seventh-day Adventists even in North America, and it's certainly not a random or representative sample of the general public. So that's something to keep in mind as you try to understand some of the results or make comparisons with other groups.
Okay.
So it wasn't targeting the Adventists within the blue zone, which is Loma Linda, right? City of Loma Linda.
Well, no, it was. It's headquartered at Loma Linda, so
Okay.
the investigators, the scientific team, was at Loma Linda, mainly at the School of Public Health, but at Loma Linda University. But the people in the study, the participants, are all over the place. So
Then compared to the blue zone.
Can
no,
you explain the blue zone?
Yeah,
Some
yeah,
people
yeah.
don't
I think
understand.
it
What
will
is the
add
blue
some
zone?
context to
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
it's beneficial to look at Adventists.
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well as a group.
I think it's good to talk about the blue zone.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, yeah. So there's some people have heard of this, and this will maybe help them understand it a little bit better. Other people will have not heard of this at all. So, but there's this concept of the blue zones, and blue zones are supposedly places where populations of people live longer. Okay, that's the idea, and they're called blue zones.
Yeah.
This is all based originally on a National Geographic article that Dan Buettner wrote. He was a journalist at the time, and then he's written books after that and kind of followed it up. But he highlighted in this article, based on certain research studies, several populations that were identified as long living.
Yeah.
This included the Italian island of Sardinia and so a population in Okinawa, and in the United States, Loma Linda was designated or labeled in this way as a blue zone. But the blue zone, it's a very loose term, and it's kind of a journalistic shorthand or something. It originally comes from the study in Sardinia, where the researchers there were looking at this little island, and they were doing a study of centenarians, or people who live to 100 or more.
Yeah.
And they counted all the centenarians and compared it to the number of people living. And so there was an actual zone of the island where there were a lot more of the people living to 100 than the rest of the island.
Did they know why?
And they circled that with a blue pencil.
Oh, okay.
So that's why it got called a
funny.
blue
Blue
zone. And so that's where the term originates from, that Sardinian study. And
Never knew
then
that.
Dan Buettner used it to, label all these kind of hot spots. Now, that doesn't mean that these are the only places in the world where people live longer. It's just these are particular areas where they were studied. And in Loma Linda, there's a lot of differences about Loma Linda and, say, the Sardinian area or part of Okinawa, because our study was not about centenarians. It was just about how long people are living on average. And it was not a study of Loma Linda. It just was headquartered at Loma Linda.
Okay.
It was a study of Seventh-day Adventists originally in California, and then the later study is all of the United States and Canada. And so to call Loma Linda a blue zone is really misleading. There's no study of Loma Linda as a town or something that people there live longer than anywhere else. It's just that
Really?
it's just that the Adventist Health Studies that study this longer living Adventist population were headquartered in Loma Linda. So that's all that means. So Loma Linda truly is not a blue zone.
It's not.
Oh, really?
Well, blue zone is not a very scientifically definable term anyway. It's just these
Okay.
places where there are long-lived populations that happen to be studied and identified.
But-
And yeah.
Would you say that in Loma Linda, that when it comes to that population, that they generally live longer? Or that as Adventists, we generally live longer?
Well, there are a lot of Adventists in Loma Linda. And, 50 years ago, maybe most people in Loma Linda were Adventists, and not so much anymore. But nobody's actually studied Loma Linda per se.
Yeah.
But there are quite a few, people that are in the Adventist Health Study who do live in Loma Linda, but the vast majority live elsewhere. And so when we say Loma Linda is a blue zone, what that really means is that Seventh-day Adventists in California or in North America live longer on average than their neighbors or the general population if you compare them. And we can talk about, kind of the numbers there, but, it's sort of they live like 5 to 7 years longer or something like that. And so that's what that really means.
That's the larger idea.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Interesting.
It's helpful.
Do genetics play into it at all? I mean, predisposition. Like you said, your dad had. You're predisposed to possibly getting narrowing of your arteries and things like that. Does that play into it? And where does the study come in to show that there's something you can change about your genetic predisposition?
Yes. Good question. Genetics plays a huge role in a lot of health risks. And it varies disease to disease, but it's a huge factor for a lot of diseases. And there
Let me simplify the question. So I have diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol running through my family. Is there anything I can do? Does the study show anything I can do to reverse that or improve or avoid or prevent?
Yeah. Well, genetic risk can be a big contributor to all of those risks. But non-genetic risk, like what we might call environment, genes versus environment. Environment is a very broad term, meaning not the natural environment, but everything other than genetics. Okay. So everything about your life other than your genes, the family you were raised in, your income, the air that you breathe, what you eat, things that you're exposed to in the water, whatever, how much you exercise, all of those are environmental factors. And lifestyle, such as diet, exercise, sleep, things like that you can choose to some extent and make up your lifestyle. That's a big part of the the non-genetic component or the environmental factors. So for most chronic diseases, major causes of death and illness like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, etc., there's usually a lot that you can do that is within your power, and specifically a lot that can be done through lifestyle choices, healthier lifestyle versus a less healthy lifestyle to reduce your risk of those diseases or increase your likelihood of living longer. So genetics is a big deal, but you can't do anything about that. But environment is also a huge factor, and some of that is within your control and some of it isn't, but relatively simple lifestyle choices like diet and like exercise can be quite powerful in their influence in your risk.
I want to go back to what you were telling Kevin. You said two things that you found, something about nuts and something else. I forgot.
Longevity.
Longevity.
Yeah.
And also with that, you were just telling Bassam, like, something you can do is diet. Define that.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
diet?
Yeah.
So all these three.
Yeah. So maybe let's talk about the longevity piece a little bit.
Sure.
Because as I mentioned, so the earlier studies like the Adventist mortality study, Adventist Health Study 1, they compared the Seventh-day Adventists in those studies to like the general California population, and they saw that they lived, it depends a little, women to men. Men, there was a little bit more of an advantage, but something like 5 to 7 years longer than. So,
Were all these Adventists vegetarian in the study?
No. Let me quote the Adventist Health Study 2. It depends how you define it, but about 50% of them are what we define as non-vegetarian.
Okay.
And then the other, which is basically eating meat more than once a week.
Okay.
And then about the other 50% we divide into 4 different other categories, like semi-vegetarian, which is eating meat sort of less than once a week, a pesco-vegetarian, which is not eating meat other than fish, let's say, for a simple definition, and then lacto-ovo-vegetarian, where they don't eat any meat or fish, but eat dairy and or eggs.
Wow.
And then vegans or total vegetarians who don't eat meat, fish, dairy, or eggs.
So you had all of those within the study.
Yeah, so in the study, about 50% using those general definitions were non-vegetarian, about a little less than 10% were vegan, a little less than 10% were pesco-vegetarian, almost 30% were lacto-ovo-vegetarian.
Okay.
So
and
it's
how
a
about
minority.
the other population? Were they mostly?
The first 50%, I guess they're doomed, right?
No.
I would like to know the difference between those who were non-vegetarian and those who were.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
Yeah. So you can look at the study population, like from the Adventist Health Study 1, these Adventists who volunteered to be in the study, and compare them to, say, the California population, and you see that.
And they're mostly meat eater?
Yeah.
Like, is it mostly the American diet, like the
there's
fast food
about 3% of Americans are vegetarian.
Okay, so it's a
So
lot less.
so one of the unique aspects of the Adventist Health Studies, why they're interesting to study as a group, and why the NIH has spent money to study them, is because they have different practices, including very little smoking, very little alcohol. So if you're not interested in studying those and you don't want them to cloud the picture, that's helpful. And then within diet, there's a lot of dietary diversity, including a much greater percentage of vegetarians and vegans. And so if you want to study the health effects of more plant-based eating, it's a group where you can do that with a reasonable study size.
Hmm.
And so so you can make these simple comparisons to the general population and say they live 6 years longer or something like that. But that doesn't tell you anything about why, and it's comparing a self-selected population to the general public, which isn't quite fair in a way. A good bit of that is just not smoking and stuff like that. But you can also, but most of what we do in the study is we look within the population and we compare people with different health habits, if you will, within the population to each other. That's more fair. We have the same data. They're all volunteers. And so, Dr. Gary Fraser, who's the principal investigator of the Adventist Health Study 2, from the Adventist Health Study 1, he and David Shavlik published a paper called 10 Extra Years, Is It a Matter of Choice? And in that paper, within the study, they identified 5 relatively simple factors that within this group were predictive of longer life or shorter life. And so the 5 factors were sort of a past history of smoking versus never having smoked, because there are some people in the study who used to smoke, but then they stopped maybe when they joined the church or something like that. So that was one factor. Regular exercise versus not much exercise. Being overweight or obese versus having a normal body weight. Being vegetarian, kind of broadly defined here, like that sort of includes very little meat or no meat, lacto-ovo, etc. Versus non-vegetarian, that 50% who eat meat regularly. And then the last factor, which we can get into in more detail because it was kind of a surprise finding, was whether people consumed nuts regularly or not. Yeah, because it's very specific compared to some of
all
those
the other ones.
I mean, all the other ones are very
typical.
Like exercise, you eat in moderation and but
somewhat
nuts.
common sense or but what's impressive is that they're all relatively simple factors. Some of them you may nod your head and say, well, that makes sense, not surprising. But if you compare within the study, if you think of those as kind of yes no questions, and you had all 5 yeses versus all 5 nos, that would be a 10-year difference in life expectancy within the Adventist group.
Wow.
Yeah.
10 years.
Yeah. So just having, if you were an Adventist who was a former smoker, overweight, non-vegetarian, non-exerciser who didn't eat nuts regularly, compared to having all those in the right direction, you would be likely to live, statistically speaking, 10 years less.
Wow.
So that's why they called the paper 10 Years of Life, Is It a Matter of Choice? Because just sort of making the right choices on those several things. And, we could probably identify some others, and some other studies have, identified some other factors, but it just underscores the point that lifestyle can have a big impact, and that impact can add up. So if you just want to identify one, thing like this diet versus that diet, or just exercise or something like that, the differences between things can be relatively small. But if you start making a lot of good choices versus a lot of bad choices, it can really add up.
That's
so
powerful.
that, you might live 10 years longer versus not.
What's so special about nuts?
So nuts. So that was one of the kind of seminal findings out of the Adventist Health Study 1. And it was sort of a surprise. So this was research by Dr. Gary Fraser again and Dr. Joanne Sabate. who went on to do a lot of studies on nuts, and is a professor at the School of Public Health in Nutrition at Loma Linda University. And this is back in the 80s. They were looking at foods and the risk of heart disease among the Adventist Health Study 1 population.
Okay.
And they were surprised to find that eating nuts regularly, it was just a simple question on a dietary questionnaire asking how frequently people ate nuts. It didn't say what kind of nuts or anything like that. It just said, do you eat them rarely or, and it gave different frequency options.
Yeah.
The people who ate them regularly, like several times a week, had about 50% less risk of going on to have a heart attack, say.
Wow.
And this was pretty surprising.
That's amazing.
This
Yeah.
was kind of in the low-fat era,
Mm-hmm.
when much dietary guidance was suggesting
fat.
reducing fat intake, especially saturated fat, but even overall fat for heart health. And so that's like what my dad was doing around that same time, was trying to eat a low-fat diet. And nuts are very high fat, relatively high fat whole food. And so it was kind of surprising at the time. And it was the first time that nuts had been associated with this reduced risk of heart disease. And Dr. Sabate went on to do a randomized trial where he fed people nuts versus not nuts and showed the impact on cholesterol, that if you ate nuts, it reduced the cholesterol. And that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine at the time. And since then, many other big cohort studies like the Nurses' Health Study and others have found similar findings to that finding from the Adventist Health Study. And there's been a lot of feeding trials or short-term studies where you randomize people to eating nuts and look at various short-term health benefits. And so the scientific evidence has built up that nuts really are quite a healthy food. And so that's why they were in that list of 5 of that longevity paper. So it's a very interesting specific heritage of the Adventist Health Study. I'm sure it probably would have been discovered somewhere, but they found it. And so it's a simple and kind of a positive thing, because some aspects of eating a healthy diet are more, feel like more deprivation. Like, I like eating at McDonald's, and you tell me to be healthier, don't eat at McDonald's. But so that's hard, to do. But if I just say, eat some nuts several times a week and it might reduce your risk of heart disease, that seems like a lot easier thing to do. So it's kind of nice to find those positive findings.
At the time we were having a conversation, and I think Kevin, you brought up that I think in the study, pescatarians had a benefit over vegans. I think is there such thing, or
well,
as far as like longevity, I think
Those
or
who eat
less
fish.
chronic disease. Or
maybe
I'm not sure.
I can't remember
Maybe.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, there have been a couple of findings like that, and a couple of those have been from papers that I happened to author. And so there was one in 2013 where this is now in the Adventist Health Study 2, and we're looking at diet patterns along that vegetarian spectrum, kind of the vegan, lacto-ovo, pesco, semi-vegetarian, and non-vegetarian. So we're comparing these groups and, how many of them died and at what ages and that sort of thing. And so the study was not published as years of life, but as risk of premature mortality, risk of dying within this period of time, let's say. And so overall, if you consider the 4 vegetarian, loosely defined groups, which is about 50% of the population, to the non-vegetarians who eat meat regularly. And I should say that even the non-vegetarians in the Adventist population eat relatively low meat compared to the general public. But the non-vegetarians had a overall somewhat reduced risk of death compared to the vegetarians overall had a somewhat reduced risk.
I was about to, I was like, what?
Yeah, it was about 10 to 12% relative risk reduction. I think it was about 12%.
So just to clarify, you're saying the vegetarian had reduced risk?
Correct. Yeah.
And those are the ones who did not consume any type of meat or dairy, or
no, it was broadly defined in this case. So let's take the 50% that includes the vegans, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, pesco-vegetarians, and semi-vegetarians, or very infrequent meat eaters, and compare them to the non-vegetarians. So that's like this half versus this half. And in doing that, overall, the vegetarian groups, loosely defined, had about, I think it was about 12%. I'd have to review the numbers because it's been a little while. But they had a somewhat reduced risk of premature death compared to the non-vegetarians.
So
then if you break it down by the specific types of vegetarian diets, you can see, how they looked. And there, the pesco vegetarians, did look somewhat more promising in that kind of initial analysis.
And these are the ones who consume some fish.
Correct.
Okay.
But, I have to kind of add a lot of qualifiers to that because remember we were talking about big studies and study power. And so these smaller groups like vegans and pesco vegetarians, we have only like 10% of the people in those groups, So you don't have as much power when you start looking at smaller and smaller groups. So that means you have more uncertainty, more influence, potential influence of chance in the findings. And so it was not, we were not able to say that one of those vegetarian diets was statistically significantly better than another one of the vegetarian type diets. So we could not say from those results that pesco vegetarians were significantly better than vegans or lacto-ovo vegetarians. Only that their point estimate was a little bit better. And similarly, when I published a paper on colorectal cancer and the dietary patterns, again, the pesco vegetarians kind of looked better overall, but it's a same sort of qualification. It's clear that they were much better than the non-vegetarians, and they looked, like they were in the lead compared to some of the other groups, but not necessarily statistically distinguishable from the other vegetarian groups. And we have had other papers looking at other findings like breast cancer or prostate cancer where the results look somewhat different, where in those vegans overall look better, but with the same kinds of qualifications. There is an updated mortality paper that the investigators are working on now. So it'll be interesting. This is now about 10 years later. So there have been quite a few more deaths. And so they'll be able to give somewhat more confident answers in terms of, overall mortality, but also different types of mortality, like, mortality from cardiovascular disease versus cancers versus neurologic diseases like Alzheimer's and things like that versus kidney diseases, and when you look at any of those specific things, again, there'll be less power, so there'll be less confidence. So I hope I'm painting a picture that, yes, we can have findings where, one thing looks a bit better in that particular analysis, but that's often far from conclusive. And what a person should be looking for, as they're not one of the study investigators, they're a person, a health professional, or a person interested in health, and they're trying to interpret the science that they hear. what you want to be looking for is findings that, kind of get clearer and clearer over time and from many different kinds of studies. And, with diet, sometimes that can be challenging.
Yeah.
But you want to look for the things that are clearer and then take action on those. And, even when I talked about statistical significance, that's just the effect of chance, saying, we're more confident about this, that we have more power, statistical power. But there's also a lot of other things that can affect results besides the actual truth or besides chance. And there are a lot of things that we call biases or confounding or things like this. And these, especially if it's not a randomized controlled trial, even with a randomized controlled trial, you can have various factors that can affect the results and bias the results. But with observational studies that are not randomized, there's even more potential for that. So you have to take things with a grain of salt, and you have to look over time for the trends in the research and things that, get clearer. And so, people have very specific questions like, I want to know what the ideal diet is, either for everybody or for me specifically. We generally can't answer that question. Maybe, we'll be able to answer it more in 100 years or something, but it's actually very, very hard to study like diet and chronic disease, because diet is like super complicated. It's not just like how much do you exercise or do you smoke or not smoke, but you can have thousands of variations of your diet. Your diet changes every day. How do we measure your diet? We ask you on a questionnaire, or, we measure it on certain days. And then, some of the risk, like we're talking risk of heart disease or cancer, it's over decades. So, your diet patterns or habits for 10, 20, 30 years might affect your risk of cancer. So we have to follow you over all that time. So there's no way to do randomized controlled trials for most of those questions. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of methodological challenges for studying a diet and the risk of disease. And but I do think, having said all that that should not discourage people too much, because there is a lot that I think we know with a great deal of confidence about how lifestyle can have that big impact, like those 10 or 12 extra years or whatever, or it can really impact your overall risk.
So let's say...
Yes, so...
Okay, go ahead.
No, go.
I'm just going to say, let's say just a random regular person watching this podcast.
I was going to say, Kevin walks into your clinic. He's obese and high blood pressure, diabetic,
No, like scientifically, like someone is watching this, they're like, okay,
what would you recommend?
here's a study, and this is scientific. What can I take from science that can help me live healthier, longer? What would you advise based on the science that you have, found in this study?
I mean, if we want to get real specific
Just
about
practical,
the Adventist Health Study, we could say, I think there's a lot of evidence originally from the Adventist Health Study that is something as simple as eating nuts frequently would likely improve your health.
No
we can...
smoking, you mentioned.
Yes. Yes.
That's another thing, actually.
Not yes.
Well,
So if you...
Sorry, I'll explain why I hesitated. We don't study the effects of smoking in the Adventist Health Study because the whole study is non-smokers, so to speak. So if you want a study to study the effects of smoking, you need a population where there are a lot of smokers so that you can compare the smokers versus the non-smokers.
Oh, I see.
But when we compare the Adventist Health Study population to the general population, we know that the difference in the rates of smoking is a big factor in the difference of health. But, so, and certainly the Adventist Health Studies have helped to show that vegetarian diets or more plant-based diets are at least a healthy alternative. Originally, vegetarian diets were studied scientifically mainly out of concern for deficiencies. What would be the health impacts of not having enough protein or not having enough iron or calcium. But in fact, large studies of vegetarians have tended to show that overall the vegetarians do quite well, often better. And it doesn't mean that it's all due to not eating meat or that sort of thing, but it certainly shows that vegetarian diets are a good option,
Would
a good
you
healthy
say
option.
that science is supporting or like showing evidence for moderation?
Oh, yes,
Like
yes, yes.
not a lot, consuming a lot of meat,
Yes.
just moderation? I don't know.
Certainly for things that have the potential, well, many things consumed to excess are are have negative impacts. And so that old adage of moderation in all things is certainly true to an extent. Maybe it's better said like nothing to excess might be a better way of saying it, because I wouldn't promote taking heroin in moderation or cyanide in moderation or something. But certainly even things that are relatively healthy can be taken to excess. So having balance and moderation and those are all good things. So for the average person, I would say don't get overly caught up or wrought up by every nutritional headline that you see and agonizing over the ideal diet, if it has a little bit of this fish or this dairy or that kind of thing. A lot of those are in the realm of scientific uncertainty anyway. And for most of us, there's a lot of relatively simple things that science has supported, and many of them are relatively common sense things. But for example, the value of regular exercise versus a sedentary lifestyle. Or if we take the diet side, diet is much more complex, but it's very clear that the standard American diet is not very healthy. And so if you have a diet that has a lot of fast foods, a lot of highly processed or ultra processed foods, or a diet that has, let's say lots of red meat and processed meat and things like that, processed carbohydrates, excess added sugars to the diet, or lots of processed starches, like white bread and things like that. Or a lot of fried foods, like deep fried foods, things like that. Those are in many studies overall, those are predicting shorter life, higher disease risk, whereas most whole foods, certainly most vegetables and fruits and a lot of whole plant foods like beans and legumes, and we talked about the nuts, and whole grains, and many of these things have health benefits, and you add them all together, and if if you include animal foods as well, again avoiding highly processed foods. So most people, with some introspection, you could say, well, let me look at my own life, what are my bad health habits? And, you probably have a sense of, what you can do, identifying some of those. And I think, some of this research, it helps to underscore that making some improvements in some relatively simple factors, it can add up over time. It can make a real difference, not overnight, but certainly it can reduce your risk of disease, make it more likely that you'll live longer and healthier. And so, people can start taking some common sense health approaches today, so if you're like agonizing over pesco vegetarian versus vegan, but that you have a bad problem, eating 3 donuts every night.
Yeah.
Focus on not eating the donuts.
Yeah.
So if we were to kind of, this is really good.
Yeah.
Really, really good. So what are, to kind of close, I guess, what are some common sense, if you were to write a prescription for living a healthier life, adding 10 extra years, living just healthily, what would you say are some things we can do?
Well, I would probably start with diet, and because we've talked a lot about that. And I would say, aiming for a more whole food diet, or avoiding a lot of ultra processed foods like that the food industry makes that are, highly kind of addictive, if
Processed.
you will, or they're
yeah.
sort of what they call hyper palatable. You want more,
Yeah.
can't just have one, that old
Yeah.
slogan. Those kind of things, eating less and less of that and more whole foods, and especially I would advocate for eating a lot of whole plant foods, such as fruits and vegetables, and nuts and seeds and legumes, beans, whole grains, those kind of things. So increasing those and decreasing some of those offenders that we talked about, like the added sugars and the deep fried foods. And oftentimes you're better cooking at home,
Yes.
and kind of
Yes.
minimizing restaurant foods. And you can learn to make better choices in restaurants,
Exactly.
but most fast foods, most convenience foods, most foods that you get at a gas station, a lot of packaged foods, are probably not the best.
Yeah.
So those are some dietary strategies that can go a long way.
Definitely.
And then physical activity is huge. And, many people are sedentary or have little physical activity. And so, the nice thing is that if you don't exercise hardly at all, and you start exercising a little bit, like 20 minutes 3 times a week or something, in the kind of studies that we do, those people that exercise a little bit do a lot better than the people who don't exercise at all.
Wow.
And so, it's good to gradually improve and to try to get more physical activity and more variety of physical activity, but doing something rather than nothing, or just, taking simple steps, starting a walking program or something like that. And then, sleep, getting a good night's sleep is very important, and a lot of things in modern life that can interfere with getting a good night's sleep, TV or mobile phones or all those kinds of things. So focusing on getting a good night's sleep, and then avoiding harmful exposures, like we've mentioned, cigarette smoking in the context of the Adventist Health Studies. That's an obvious one, but nonetheless, avoiding that and avoiding or minimizing alcohol consumption. More and more evidence suggests, minimal to no alcohol is likely best for your health. And so those are some, big factors.
Definitely.
And, you start to add those up. And, there are other things like, socialization and socialization, meaning, having a support system, having friends, investing in relationships, being with people, those kind of things, they can make a big difference. Like, for example, married men live a lot longer than unmarried men, for
Yeah.
example.
Wow.
Things like that. And of course, there are a lot of things on the medical side, like getting your cancer screenings or
Yeah.
vaccinations or whatever, that can make a big difference. And so not neglecting those things. So when you add all these things up, they can make a real difference. And but what I don't want to seem to imply or portray that just because making a number of simple choices can be a big benefit to your health and your risk of diseases, it doesn't mean that it's easy.
Yeah.
So, that's a whole nother discussion. But changing health habits is actually quite hard.
Yeah.
And even, for someone like me who, is trained in different ways and knows a lot, and, it's still hard. It's still hard when I'm trying to tackle my bad health habits or start new health habits. It's hard. And I have a lot of advantages. And, the other thing that I might point out is, everybody doesn't have the same advantages. And, everybody doesn't have a middle class lifestyle and adequate free time to think about their health and make all the appropriate plans and the energy to put that into practice. And so we talked about the 5 to 7 years maybe that Adventists live compared to the general population longer, and the 10 years based on some of those choices within the Adventist population. But you can go to a metro area in the United States, like I've seen some studies of like Washington, D.C. or something like that, and you compare the wealthiest neighborhoods to the poorest neighborhoods, often just 10 miles away from each other. And you can have life expectancies in the wealthiest neighborhoods of like 90s.
Wow.
And in the poorest neighborhoods of like 50s.
Wow.
So, there are a lot of societal factors that that people deal with, and a lot of disparities of resources, and also the same thing globally. There are a lot of places where people are struggling with so many challenges, and just to survive day to day. And so if you're somebody who has a little bit of time and a little bit of a chance to reflect, be grateful for that, and see what choices you can make or simple changes you can make to start yourself in a positive direction and enjoy the benefits of longer life, less risk of disease, but also often feeling better, having more energy, and those kind of things that are more immediate rewards.
For
That's
sure.
awesome.
What
you.
happened with your dad afterwards? How long?
Oh,
how
yeah.
much longer did he live?
So my dad did very well after that. He made all those changes, and so he was 53 when he had the heart attack and the bypass surgery. He ended up living another 30 years, and he didn't die from heart disease. He ended up dying from esophageal cancer. So a totally different kind of thing. But I never, at the time when he had that heart attack at 53, I never thought he would live that long.
Wow.
So I think his lifestyle changes definitely made a difference. And certainly, were an inspiration and a role model to, some of us who were close to him as well.
For sure.
And my dad, he was a steel worker, had a high school education, had a hard life, grew up very poor. But, when he had that heart attack, he just made the determination, I'm going to do what they tell me to do, And he was a stubborn, kind of guy, and he applied all his stubbornness. So they tell me I'm going to eat, less than 1,500 milligrams of sodium, I'm going to do it. And so, you may not have all the advantages. You may have some existing health challenges, but just making a determination to make some changes and to do what you can do you have more power to affect your health and your future than any other individual.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that story.
This was
Thank you.
really good. Thank
I
you.
enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
Awesome,
Thank you so
awesome,
much.
yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
We'll do another one maybe. We'll get more in details. But thanks for coming.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome.